December 19, 1944. The Ardennes forest lay buried under a crushing silence, broken only by the groan of wind through the pines and the distant rumble of artillery. Bastogne was frozen in more ways than one. The snow covered everything. Tree branches bent under its weight, foxholes were choked with ice, and weapons jammed if they weren't cleaned every few hours. The mist hung low that morning, thick enough to blur the tree line into a pale wall. Somewhere within that wall, an American machine gunner named Frank Miller waited. Frank's uniform was stiff with frost, his helmet rim white with a thin crust of ice. He rubbed his hands together, blew into them, then adjusted the feed tray of his Browning M1919. The weapon sat atop a makeshift mound of sandbags and frozen earth. It was heavy, old but reliable, just like the man who carried it. He wasn't special by any official measure. No medals, no officers' bars, just a quiet infantryman who had spent too many nights in trenches to count. But this morning, he stood at the edge of something far larger than himself. The Battle of the Bulge had erupted days earlier, catching the Allies off guard. German forces had surged through the Ardennes with frightening speed, splitting American lines and sending whole regiments falling back in confusion. Frank's unit had been ordered to withdraw toward Bastogne, regroup, and establish a defensive line. But as the retreat began, the narrow forest path they'd taken became a bottleneck. Vehicles jammed the road. Soldiers tripped over each other in the snow. Voices barked orders that were swallowed by fog. And through it all, Frank noticed something others didn't. This single path was the only viable route for German armor to advance toward the town from the north. If this path fell without resistance, Bastogne's flank would be exposed. Tanks could roll through in formation, bypassing the prepared defenses entirely. But nobody seemed to realize it. Men were too busy running, trucks reversing, officers shouting conflicting commands. Frank watched them disappear into the fog, his gloved hands tightening on the grips of his machine gun. A radio operator nearby yelled that they needed to move. Frank didn't answer. His breath came out in heavy clouds, merging with the mist. The sound came first, distant, metallic, rhythmic, tracks clanking on frozen ground. It was faint, almost imagined, but he recognized it. German half-tracks, maybe even tanks moving through the forest. The retreating column hadn't heard it yet. They were too far ahead, but Frank was still close enough to the tree line. He turned toward the sound, eyes narrowing, and saw a faint shimmer through the fog. Movement. The Germans were coming down that road. He scanned the abandoned defensive position around him. There was a small machine gun nest carved into the slope, half buried in snow. Empty ammunition crates lay scattered nearby. A few mortar rounds were frozen to the ground. It was barely a position anymore, just a hole in the earth. But in that moment, Frank saw something others had missed, a choke point. The road curved tightly through a narrow stretch between two ridges. A single well-placed machine gun could sweep the entire bend, forcing vehicles to halt or bottleneck. The retreat order still echoed in his ears. He was supposed to leave. No heroics, no last stands. Bastogne needed every man alive. But Frank wasn't thinking about glory. He was thinking like a soldier who had walked enough roads to know how terrain worked. If he left now, the Germans would roll through in less than an hour. If he stayed, maybe, just maybe, he could slow them down long enough for someone behind him to prepare. He knelt in the snow, feeling the cold bite through his knees, and began checking his gear with deliberate precision. He had 4 ammo belts, each carefully rolled. He laid them beside the gun, keeping the tips out of the snow to avoid jams. He filled his canteen with snow to melt later. He fixed the gun's tripod in place, pressing it deep into the frozen ground. Every motion was practiced, silent. There was no rush. He had made his choice. Somewhere down the road, an officer shouted through the fog, "Miller, move out!" Frank didn't respond. The voice called again, sharper, but by then he was already crouched behind the gun, eyes trained on the bend in the road. The fog pressed close around him, muting the world. For a moment, it was just him, the gun, and the sound of distant engines growing louder. The retreating column eventually vanished completely, swallowed by distance. Frank was alone now. His breath froze against his scarf. The only warmth came from the machine gun, the faint heat of his body against cold metal. He looked down at the trigger assembly, then up at the road again. He wasn't a man who gave speeches. Nobody would know what he was about to do, There would be no witnesses, no cheering crowd, just one machine gunner on a forgotten road outside Bastogne, staring into a white void and waiting for an enemy that was coming whether he was ready or not. He shifted his weight, rested his finger against the cold trigger, and muttered under his breath, "All right, let's see." The sound of engines was louder now, echoing like a drumbeat through the trees. He wasn't retreating, he was digging in. The order to retreat had been clear. The battalion commander's voice had crackled through the field radios hours earlier. "Pull back to Bastogne and regroup. All units fall back immediately. Do not stay behind." It was a standard tactical decision. The front was folding, the Germans were advancing faster than expected, and Bastogne was the logical strong point. But orders on paper rarely matched the chaos of real ground. By late morning, the forest road had become a scene of controlled panic. Jeeps backfired as they tried to reverse through the snow. Trucks overloaded with equipment stalled on inclines. Medics dragged stretchers through mud that had frozen into jagged ruts overnight. Men barked orders in every direction, but the fog swallowed their voices. Radios struggled to maintain contact. It was the kind of moment where discipline frayed, not because men were cowards, but because the situation outpaced command. Frank Miller stood just off the main path, watching the entire retreat unfold like a silent observer. He saw lieutenants trying to coordinate movements, sergeants cursing, privates stumbling through the snow. He heard the same phrase repeated again and again: "Fall back, move, now." But behind those orders there was something unspoken, a creeping sense that they were running blind. The terrain behind them was a patchwork of frozen fields and narrow forest lanes. If the Germans broke through here, Bastogne would be surrounded faster than anyone could react. A young corporal jogged past Frank, waving frantically. "Miller, what are you doing? Grab your kit, we're pulling back." Frank didn't move. He glanced at the corporal, then at the narrow bend in the road ahead. It was a natural choke point. On one side, a steep incline covered in pine trees. On the other, a shallow ravine. Vehicles couldn't go around it. Infantry couldn't flank easily. If the Germans advanced here, they'd have to funnel through single file. It was textbook terrain for a defensive stand, the kind of spot they drilled for but rarely encountered in reality. "Didn't you hear me?" The corporal barked again, breath forming clouds in the air. "We're leaving." Frank's eyes lingered on the curve of the road, as if weighing an equation only he could see. Finally, he answered quietly, "If we leave this open, they'll be in Bastogne by nightfall." The corporal frowned, caught between orders and logic. "That's not your call, Miller. We don't have the numbers to hold. Move." Frank didn't argue. He simply turned back toward the gun nest he had found earlier and began checking the barrel of his Browning. The corporal hesitated for a moment, then cursed under his breath and ran to catch up with the others, disappearing into the fog. For a few seconds, Frank was the only sound on that frozen road metal clicking softly, cloth shifting, breath steady. He thought of the order again: retreat, regroup, do not stay behind. It was rational, but Frank wasn't driven by disobedience for its own sake. He was a machine gunner, trained to think in arcs of fire and fields of control. He had spent years dragging the heavy M19 through mud, over hedgerows, into foxholes. He understood the rhythm of ground combat. Terrain dictated survival, and this terrain was screaming for someone to hold it, if only for a little while. The distant rumble grew clearer. The metallic grind of treads on ice was no longer a background hum. It was a steady, deliberate approach. German half-tracks, maybe even tanks, were moving closer. Frank pictured them emerging through the mist, armored noses glistening with frost, infantry crouched along their flanks. He knew how they operated. A probing scout team would appear first. If they met no resistance, the column would push straight through. If they encountered fire, they'd slow down, deploy troops and radio for artillery. Every minute of delay mattered. He pulled the gun around, aligning it with the bend in the road. He adjusted the tripod legs, pressing them deep into the frozen ground until they bit into the soil. He laid out 3 ammo belts beside him, each coiled carefully, tips gleaming like dull brass snakes. The 4th he draped loosely over the gun's receiver, ready to feed. He adjusted his helmet strap, tugged his gloves tight, and set his jaw. Behind him, the last stragglers of the retreat disappeared into the fog. A jeep backfired once, twice, then was swallowed by the distance. The forest fell eerily still. Even the artillery in the far distance seemed to pause. Frank knew exactly what he was doing. It wasn't a rash act. It was a calculated refusal. He wasn't holding the line because of pride or orders. He was doing it because the terrain demanded someone to do it, and nobody else had stayed. If he left, the road would be empty. If he stayed, there'd be at least a heartbeat of resistance. He found a dry patch of scarf to wipe the frost off the gun sight. Through the narrowing curtain of fog, he imagined where the enemy would appear. His breathing slowed. His heartbeat matched the rhythm of the distant treads. He felt the strange calm that sometimes settled over soldiers in moments like this. Not bravery, exactly, but a kind of quiet clarity, the acceptance of a role. The radio crackled weakly at his feet, still tuned to battalion command. Voices were distant, jumbled, issuing orders he no longer intended to follow. He turned the volume down until it was just a murmur, like background static. Above the tree line, the sound of engines was close now, close enough to feel through the ground. Frank Miller wasn't retreating. He wasn't charging either. He was anchoring. Alone, on a frozen forest road outside Bastogne, he had chosen to become the point at which the advance would either stumble or break. The fog clung to the forest like a shroud as Frank Miller began to transform the abandoned position into something deadly. He moved with quiet purpose, his breath steady despite the biting cold. Every motion had weight. This wasn't a frenzied act of desperation, but the methodical work of a soldier who understood exactly what was coming. The machine gun nest sat slightly elevated above the curve in the road, giving him a commanding angle over the narrow pass. From here, any vehicle or infantry trying to push through would be exposed for a few crucial seconds. Frank knew those seconds were everything. He scanned the tree line, counting off distances in his head like a carpenter measuring a frame. 50 yards to the first bend, 70 to the ridgeline, maybe 100 to the open patch where vehicles would emerge from the mist. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He started by dragging half-frozen sandbags into place, reinforcing the front of the nest. The original defensive line had been hastily abandoned, bags ripped open, some half buried in snow, but with a few minutes of effort, Frank built himself a low, solid wall. He stamped the ground around the tripod to steady it further, then double-checked the gun's angle against the bend in the road. The barrel pointed straight into the heart of the curve. Next came the ammunition. He unrolled the belts and laid them in shallow grooves in the snow, covering them lightly with a tarp to keep moisture off the brass. He checked the rounds one by one, brushing away frost, ensuring none were dented or dirty. A jam at the wrong moment could be fatal, and he'd seen too many good men lose their positions to a single bad link. He loaded the first belt into the receiver, locking it down with a solid, satisfying click. Frank wasn't just preparing the gun, he was preparing the field. He scanned the flanks of the road, noting where snowbanks and tree trunks created natural cover. To his left, a half-buried log offered a fallback firing position if he had to move. To his right, a frozen ditch curved toward the tree line, providing a narrow escape route if things went badly. He noted each of these options like waypoints on a mental map. He wasn't planning to run, but a man who prepared to fight alone didn't survive by being romantic. He survived by being practical. Then he spotted something else. Just before the bend, a large pine tree leaned over the road, its branches heavy with snow. If a half-track or truck passed beneath, the branches might momentarily obscure the gunner's view. A tiny advantage, but Frank filed it away. Combat often hinged on small details like that. The sound of engines was growing louder now, no longer distant but approaching deliberately. Frank crouched low and peered through the fog. He caught glimpses, a glint of metal, the vague outline of a vehicle. His heartbeat slowed rather than quickened. His training took over. He checked the rear sight, adjusted the traverse slightly, and lined up on the narrowest point of the road. He had perhaps 5 minutes before contact. In that time, he set small traps, not explosives, but psychological ones. He placed 2 spare helmets on sticks behind a snowbank to his left, positioned just enough to catch the eye of approaching soldiers. They'd look like additional defenders, maybe a flanking position. He dragged a spare blanket halfway up the ridge behind him, making it appear from a distance like movement. None of this would hold off trained soldiers for long, but it would buy seconds of hesitation, and seconds were all he needed. As he worked, he thought briefly about the retreating column. They were probably halfway to Bastogne by now, falling into defensive positions, setting up roadblocks, trying to make sense of the chaos. Nobody would know that he was still here. There would be no radio reports, no cheering officers. If he died here, the most anyone would say was that he went missing in the fog. And yet, there was a quiet satisfaction in that. Frank had always been the kind of soldier who worked best when nobody was watching on the gun line, in the dark, where skill mattered more than rank. There was no drama in what he was doing now, just cold air, snow, steel, and focus. The first German scout vehicle appeared like a ghost, its shape materializing slowly from the mist. A half-track, armored nose slick with frost, a pair of infantrymen crouched near the front bumper. They moved cautiously, rifles raised, scanning the tree line. Frank didn't fire yet. He let them roll forward, counting the seconds. 10 yards, 20, 30. They entered the bend right into his killing zone. He exhaled slowly, just once, and squeezed the trigger. The Browning roared to life, a deafening burst that shattered the stillness of the forest. The muzzle flash lit the nest in violent orange bursts. Brass casings ejected in a steady rhythmic stream. The first burst shredded the front of the half-track, chewing through the windshield and cutting down the infantrymen before they could react. The vehicle jerked to a halt, its engine whining under the impact. Frank didn't linger on his success. He shifted slightly, sending a second controlled burst toward the tree line where German soldiers dove for cover. Snow erupted in plumes. The ambush was clean, efficient, and above all, unexpected. The Germans had walked straight into the jaws of a lone machine gun nest that shouldn't have been there. The forest exploded into chaos. Shouts in German echoed through the fog. Return fire cracked against the sandbags, kicking up snow. Bullets whined overhead. Frank ducked low, feeding the belt smoothly with his gloved hand, eyes never leaving the bend. This was exactly where he wanted them, stalled, confused, reacting instead of advancing. For the first time that day, he allowed himself a thin, almost imperceptible smile. The trap was sprung. The first burst had shattered the quiet of the forest, and now the sound of battle rolled through the trees like a wave. Frank Miller stayed low behind his sandbag wall, feeding the Browning with practiced rhythm. The gun's steady chatter echoed down the road, ricocheting off the icy ridges on either side. Smoke mixed with the fog, curling upward in ghostly tendrils. He wasn't just shooting blindly. Every burst was measured, aimed at keeping the enemy pinned where the road bent tight. The German half-track sputtered where it had stopped, its windshield shredded. The gunner slumped over the front mount. Behind it, more vehicles ground to a halt, their engines growling in confusion. The narrow road worked in Frank's favor. The column couldn't fan out. The vehicles were stuck nose to tail like beads on a frozen string. The only way forward was through his field of fire, and as long as he was alive, that wasn't happening. The Germans responded quickly. Shouts in sharp-clipped voices cut through the gunfire. A squad of infantry spilled off the road, diving for cover behind snowbanks and trees. They tried to flank left, but Frank had anticipated that. He shifted the Browning's traverse and sent a burst through the low branches, forcing them back down. The fog turned the forest into a maze. They couldn't tell how many defenders were out there. His dummy helmets and blanket decoys had done their job. There was hesitation in their movements, uncertainty in their positioning. Frank's hands moved automatically, tapped the charging handle, guide the belt, check the barrel. He counted the rounds not in numbers, but in feel. How long a belt lasted, the rhythm between bursts. He had 3 belts left, maybe 4 if he rationed carefully. If he fired constantly, he'd run dry in minutes. If he fired smart, he could hold this stretch of road for hours. The Germans weren't going to let him sit there forever. After the initial shock, they regrouped. Frank caught a glimpse of an officer crouching behind the second vehicle, gesturing sharply. 2 soldiers ran forward through the ditch, moving low. Another group tried to use the leaning pine tree for cover, inching closer with every pause in his fire. Frank shifted position slightly, leaned into the gun and cut a clean arc across the tree line. Snow erupted around them, and one soldier dropped, motionless. The rest fell back. Still, their presence was growing. He could hear more engines in the distance, heavier ones, tanks, the deep rolling clatter of treads on ice. The sound made the ground beneath him tremble faintly. Frank gritted his teeth. Half-tracks he could stall, trucks he could destroy. But tanks would be a different kind of fight. He forced himself to stay calm. Tanks moved slower in these woods. The narrow road would funnel them just like the trucks. If he could delay the infantry, the armor would bottleneck behind them. That meant more time. Time was his real weapon, not the gun. The return fire intensified. Bullets thudded into the sandbags, kicked up sprays of snow, or cracked against the ridge behind him. A round ricocheted off the metal receiver, showering him with splinters of ice. He kept his head low, shifting between short bursts and sudden silences, using the fog to make it sound like multiple guns firing from different positions. Every time the Germans started to advance, he'd hit them with another burst, forcing them to freeze, rethink, pull back. It was a dance of hesitation, and Frank was leading. Minutes turned into an hour. His fingers were numb, the metal of the gun freezing against his gloves. The barrel was hot enough to steam when snowflakes landed on it. He swapped it out quickly, just like he'd been trained, his movements fluid despite the cold. A part of him couldn't quite believe he was still alive. Another part didn't have time to think about it. The Germans tried smoke grenades next. White plumes billowed across the road, merging with the natural fog. It was clever. They were trying to obscure his vision, close the distance, maybe flank under cover. Frank responded by tracing fire through the smoke, not to hit specific targets, but to remind them that the road was still a death zone. He listened more than he looked, ears tuned for movement, boots on snow, shouted orders, the creak of equipment. His senses sharpened until each sound stood out like a note in a song. At one point, a grenade landed just short of his position, hissing softly in the snow. He didn't flinch. He grabbed it by the spoon and hurled it back down the slope in one smooth motion. A distant explosion cracked through the mist, followed by angry Germans shouting. By now the enemy clearly understood they weren't facing a full platoon. The volume of fire was too controlled, the angles too consistent. But they still couldn't pin him down, and they couldn't risk charging the road head-on without softening him up first. And every minute they stalled was another minute for Bastogne to prepare. Frank glanced at his dwindling ammo belts. 2 left. His water canteen was frozen solid, his hands trembling slightly from cold and exhaustion. His scarf was stiff with ice. And yet, there was no thought of retreat in his mind. He wasn't fighting for a medal. He wasn't expecting reinforcements. He was simply holding the line because someone had to. The sound of engines deepened. A tank was getting close now. He could hear the grinding treads just beyond the bend. The next phase of the fight was coming, and he knew the odds were getting worse. But he adjusted his helmet strap, reloaded another belt, and leaned into the gun once more. Somewhere down that foggy road, German armor was coming. And between them and Bastogne stood one man with a Browning and a plan. The rumble came first deep, resonant, and unmistakable. German armor was rolling toward the bend. Frank Miller pressed his gloved hands against the cold grips of the Browning, listening as the sound grew heavier. He had heard tanks before in France, in the hedgerows. But there was something different here. In the forest, the sound didn't just approach. It filled the space, bouncing between the ridges like thunder trapped in a canyon. Through the thinning fog, the dark silhouette of a Panzer IV slowly emerged. Its wide treads crushed the snow, grinding branches beneath its weight. The half-track he had disabled earlier lay across the road like a wounded animal, forcing the tank to slow down. Behind the Panzer, Frank caught glimpses of more vehicles. Another tank, maybe 2, and trucks packed with infantry. This wasn't just a probing patrol. It was a column advancing on a key route to Bastogne. Frank's heart hammered in his chest, but his mind stayed clear. He wasn't going to destroy the tank knot with what he had, but he could delay it. Force it to maneuver, stall its infantry, make it hesitate. Every hesitation was another heartbeat for the defenders behind him. The Panzer halted near the curve, engine idling like a low growl. Its turret turned slowly, scanning the tree line. The German infantry, cautious after the earlier ambush, spread out along the roadside, hugging the snowbanks. One squad crept along the ditch, another moved toward the pine tree cover he'd identified earlier. Frank watched them through the iron sights, waiting for the right moment. He wasn't going to waste rounds spraying at steel. His job now was to pin the men who made the tank dangerous. The first machine gun burst cracked through the fog, tearing into the squad by the ditch. 2 soldiers went down instantly. The rest scattered, throwing themselves into the snow. The Panzer's gun barked back, a booming shot that obliterated a chunk of the ridge behind him, showering the nest with earth and ice. The shockwave slammed against his chest, but he stayed prone, adjusting the gun slightly. He had chosen his position well. The nest sat just off-center from the road, low enough that the tank couldn't get a clean line of fire without exposing its flank. The Germans responded with discipline. Mortar shells began to arc overhead, landing closer with each thump. Snow and dirt erupted in geysers around the nest. Frank hugged the ground, covering the receiver with his body to keep snow from jamming it. When the explosions paused, he came up swinging, sending a burst toward a group of infantry trying to push forward under cover of the blasts. His rounds tore through the smoke, catching them mid-sprint. Their momentum died on the spot. Then came the tank's coaxial machine gun. The chatter was relentless, chewing through the snowbank in front of him. Bullets hissed past his ears, snapping branches like twigs. Frank ducked lower, feeding the belt smoothly, waiting for the right rhythm. When the coaxial paused for reload, he popped up and fired at the tank commander's cupola, forcing the German officer to slam the hatch shut. For a moment, the tank was blind. That moment mattered. The Panzer lurched forward, trying to push past the wrecked half-track. Its treads struggled for traction on the icy road. The vehicle's bulk filled the entire bend, creating a traffic jam behind it. Frank could see the column backing up other tanks, trucks, infantry piling up in a choke point they couldn't escape. He had turned the road into a bottleneck of steel, and every second they spent there was another second the Americans in Bastogne could dig in. The Germans grew more aggressive. A squad managed to creep close along the ravine, flanking toward the right. Frank shifted fire instantly, short controlled bursts, forcing them to crawl backward into cover. He heard shouted commands in German, angry, urgent. They were realizing now that they weren't facing a full platoon, just one gun. But that didn't make him less dangerous. It made him unpredictable. The tank fired again, this time hitting closer. The blast threw snow and dirt into his face. His ears rang. His breath came in visible bursts. His ammo belts were running low. Just 1.5 left. He forced himself to slow his fire, aiming only when he saw movement. Every round mattered now. Time began to blur. Frank lost track of minutes, maybe hours. His shoulders ached from the gun's recoil. His gloves were stiff with ice, and his fingers were numb. His world narrowed to the rhythm of the Browning, the smell of cordite, and the distant mechanical growl of frustrated armor. He was no longer thinking about orders or retreat or even survival. He was locked in the cold, relentless mechanics of defense. At some point, he caught sight of something through the mist behind the German column, a flicker of light, a sound carried on the wind. It wasn't German. It was the faint, distant rumble of American artillery, like thunder rolling in the distance. Reinforcements were on the move. He didn't know when they'd arrive, but he knew one thing. If he could hold just a little longer, help was coming. The Germans didn't know that. All they saw was a forest road that refused to yield, a single machine gun that kept biting at their advance, and a man they couldn't flush out. Frank clenched his jaw, locked another belt into place, and leaned back behind the gun. The tank turret creaked again, searching. The battle wasn't over. But for now, the line still held, and one man was still holding it. The fight dragged on into the gray, frozen afternoon. The fog that had once cloaked the forest began to thin, revealing the battered landscape Frank Miller had turned into a makeshift stronghold. The snow around his nest was torn and blackened by gunfire. Empty brass casings piled up like spent seeds. Smoke drifted lazily from the wrecked half-track on the road. The Panzer still idled near the bend, its crew frustrated and pinned, while the vehicles behind it were locked in a steel traffic jam stretching into the woods. Frank's body felt like a machine that had run too long in the cold. His hands were numb, His shoulders burned from hours of recoil, and his eyes watered from the mix of smoke and winter air. He was down to his last belt of ammunition, carefully rationing each burst. He no longer fired at every shadow. He waited for movement he could confirm, an officer exposing himself to signal, a squad inching forward under cover, a tank commander daring to peek out of his hatch. Every pull of the trigger counted. The Germans, realizing brute force wasn't working, shifted tactics. They began to pull some of their infantry back, likely to regroup for a coordinated push. A few men crept forward along the ravine, trying to get close enough to lob grenades. Frank anticipated it. He switched to short bursts, cutting through the thin veil of fog and hitting them before they reached throwing distance. His accuracy was uncanny, the kind that came not from heroics, but from years of repetition, of knowing exactly how the gun bucked, how the sights aligned, how the snow muffled sound. Then came the moment he'd been expecting. The Panzer's engine revved louder, and the tank began to push forward in earnest. Its treads crunched over the wrecked half-track, shoving it aside with brute strength. The gun turret swung toward Frank's nest. He knew what was coming, a direct shot. If the tank got a clear line, the fight would be over in seconds. Frank didn't panic. He adjusted the gun's traverse one last time and aimed not at the tank, but at the infantry swarming behind it. As the Panzer inched forward, he unleashed a sustained burst at the column's soft underbelly drivers, gunners, riflemen clustered along the road. His last belt rattled through the receiver, sending tracers cutting through the air like streaks of orange fire. The Germans scrambled, some diving into the snow, others dragging wounded men off the road. The Panzer halted again, its crew suddenly exposed without supporting infantry. Frank's Browning fell silent. The belt clicked empty. He pulled the feed tray open and stared at the cold brass links and nothing left. He reached for his sidearm, checked his last grenades. If they came now, he'd fight with whatever he had. But then he heard it, a low, distant thunder that didn't belong to the Panzer. American artillery. It rolled through the forest like a heartbeat, growing louder by the second. The German troops froze mid-movement, heads turning toward the sound. Frank crawled up just enough to peer over his sandbag wall. Through the thinning fog down the road, faint shapes began to emerge. American half-tracks and jeeps, headlights muted under winter tarps moving fast. Reinforcements. The German column had been stalled long enough for help to arrive. The Panzer reversed awkwardly, trying to pivot in the narrow road. German infantry shouted frantically, scrambling back toward their vehicles. Within minutes, artillery shells began to fall in the distance behind the column, cutting off their line of retreat. The tightly packed German vehicles had nowhere to go. Some tried to turn around. Others simply abandoned their positions and ran for the tree line. Frank leaned back against the cold earth, exhaling a long, shaky breath. His hands trembled from exhaustion and cold. He'd been alone for hours, holding a narrow forest road against an armored column with nothing but his Browning, his wits, and the terrain. Now, at last, the weight began to lift. He wasn't dead. The line hadn't broken. Bastogne still stood. When the first American troops reached his position, they found him half buried in snow, gun blackened with soot, scarf stiff with ice. One sergeant climbed into the nest and stared down the road at the wreckage, the stalled Panzer, the scattered German gear. "You did all this?" he asked, disbelief in his voice. Frank didn't answer immediately. He just gave a tired nod and reached for the empty canteen at his side. The sergeant shook his head slowly, a grin breaking through the grime. "Hell of a stand, Miller." Word of what happened spread through the ranks over the following days. Nobody had ordered Frank to hold that road. There had been no officers, no grand speeches, just one machine gunner who decided to disobey the retreat order because the ground told him to. His actions delayed the German advance long enough for Bastogne's defenders to fortify the perimeter, changing the tempo of the fight in that sector. In the official reports, his stand was described in a few short lines. Machine gunner held position, enemy advance delayed, reinforcements arrived. But among the men, it became something more, the story of the American who stayed when everyone else left, the lone figure in the fog who turned a narrow road into a wall. Frank Miller never saw himself as a hero. He had simply made a decision and carried it through, bullet by bullet, hour by hour, until the sound of help arrived. In war, Some victories aren't marked by medals. They're marked by the moments when one person refuses to move.